devastating wars, World War II often takes center stage. But what if I told you the Vietnam War was even worse? Brutal combat conditions. The combat conditions were more grueling, the enemy was everywhere, and the psychological toll was far beyond what most World War II soldiers experienced. Fighting in Vietnam was a nightmare beyond comparison. The dense, humid jungles of Vietnam made every step a potential death trap. Unlike World War II's battlefields, where soldiers fought in cities, beaches, and open fields, Vietnam's battlefront was an unrelenting jungle.
I think the Vietnam War drove a stake right into the heart of America. Unfortunately, we've never moved really far away from that, and we never recovered.
Visibility was limited, and the enemy, hidden in trees, tunnels, and villages, was nearly impossible to spot until it was too late. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army mastered guerrilla tactics, launching hit-and-run attacks, using underground tunnels, and setting devastating booby traps that made survival a constant struggle. Both wars were brutal in their own ways, but Vietnam added a constant paranoia. Every step, every shadow, every innocent face could be a deadly trap.
You know, I still have nightmares.
Even to this day, I'm stuck in that moment.
The Viet Cong used gruesome traps designed to maim and terrorize. Punji stick pits filled with bamboo spikes covered in filth to cause infections. Tripwire grenades hidden along jungle paths, ready to explode with a single misstep. Bamboo whip traps, spring-loaded spikes aimed at the face or chest. The paranoia of never knowing where the next attack would come from pushed soldiers to the brink of insanity.
The real heroes are the men that died. To see these kids who had the least to gain, and yet their loyalty to each other, their courage under fire, was just phenomenal.
Unlike World War II, where enemies were clearly defined, Vietnam fighters blended into the civilian population. That farmer, that child, they could be armed and ready to kill by nightfall. World War II had clear objectives: capture a city, take a hill, secure a beachhead. In Vietnam, there were no front lines. Every village, every rice paddy, every supposed safe zone could be a trap. American soldiers were ambushed in their own bases, attacked while eating, and bombarded in their sleep. There was no sense of security, no moment to let your guard down. The Viet Cong's underground tunnel system allowed them to move unseen, store weapons, and stage surprise attacks. American tunnel rats had to crawl into these claustrophobic death traps, facing enemies in the dark. Meanwhile, monsoons, heat exhaustion, malaria, and Agent Orange exposure made survival even more grueling. Some are still fighting it today, not on the battlefield, but in hospital rooms, as their children and grandchildren suffer the consequences of a war they never fought. So while World War II was a war of vast, destructive battles, Vietnam was an unrelenting, inescapable nightmare. No clear enemy, no safe ground. Just fear, paranoia, and an unforgiving jungle swallowing soldiers whole. But if surviving Vietnam was a nightmare, coming home was its own kind of hell. Veteran treatment. The treatment of veterans returning from the Vietnam War was vastly different from the warm welcome World War II soldiers received. Unlike the heroes of World War II, who were greeted with parades and gratitude, Vietnam veterans often returned to a country that wanted nothing to do with them. The war had become deeply unpopular, and instead of being honored for their service, many were met with hostility, neglect, and a system that failed them. When World War II ended, soldiers came home to celebrations, cheers, and nationwide recognition for their sacrifices. But Vietnam veterans faced a much colder reception. They returned to a nation bitterly divided, where some people viewed them not as warriors, but as villains. They were called names like baby killers, spat on in public, and blamed for a war they never chose to fight. Unlike their World War II counterparts, who were universally seen as defenders of freedom, Vietnam veterans became scapegoats for the frustration of an entire country. Anti-war protests filled the streets, and instead of separating the war from the warrior, many Americans took their anger out on the very people who had risked their lives. Beyond the public hostility, the government itself failed to provide the support these veterans desperately needed. After World War II, the GI Bill helped returning soldiers build a stable future by offering financial aid for housing, education, and employment. But for Vietnam veterans, that same level of assistance was difficult to access. The Veterans Administration was underfunded and overwhelmed, leaving many struggling with long delays and little help. Worse yet, the psychological trauma they suffered was largely ignored. In World War II, mental health issues were at least recognized as combat fatigue or shell shock. But Vietnam veterans suffering from PTSD were often left to fend for themselves. Many turned to drugs and alcohol to escape the nightmares of war, and instead of getting help, they were pushed further into isolation. And then there was Agent Orange, the toxic chemical sprayed over the jungles of Vietnam to destroy enemy cover. Thousands of American soldiers were exposed, leading to cancer, birth defects in their children, and severe neurological disorders. For years, the government refused to acknowledge the devastating effects, delaying compensation and medical care for those who needed it most. Finding a place in society after the war proved even more difficult. Many veterans struggled with unemployment, unable to secure stable jobs, and the number of homeless Vietnam veterans skyrocketed in the following decades. Their mental health suffered, their communities had abandoned them, and unlike World War II veterans, who were embraced by their country, many Vietnam vets felt forgotten. But as devastating as their treatment was, something even more unsettling loomed over Vietnam. Something that made many soldiers question why they were even there in the first place. We'll get to that soon. It wasn't until the 1980s, long after the war had ended, that the nation began to formally recognize their sacrifices with the dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Meanwhile, World War II veterans had been honored from the moment they stepped off the battlefield. The difference in treatment came down to public perception, government support, and the long-term consequences of an unpopular war. World War II was seen as a noble fight, a battle for democracy, and its veterans were hailed as the greatest generation. But Vietnam was controversial, and its soldiers were caught in the crossfire, not just overseas but at home. The hostility, neglect, and lasting scars of war made the experience of Vietnam veterans far worse than that of those who fought in World War II. Beyond combat and veteran treatment, another major factor that set Vietnam apart was how it was seen: media exposure. One of the biggest reasons the Vietnam War was perceived as worse than World War II was the role of the media. Vietnam was the first televised war, exposing the American public to its brutal realities in a way that World War II never did. For the first time, war was brought directly into American homes, uncensored, unfiltered, and impossible to ignore. Night after night, people watched disturbing footage of wounded soldiers, civilian casualties, and the sheer destruction of battle. The result? A growing wave of anti-war sentiment and a dramatic shift in how the war, and the soldiers fighting it, were perceived. During World War II, media coverage was carefully controlled. Reporters were embedded with military units, but they had to follow strict guidelines. The US government filtered what was shown to the public, ensuring that coverage painted American troops in a heroic light. Newsreels, propaganda films, and posters all worked to unite the nation, portraying the war as a necessary fight for freedom and democracy. And when it came to the horrors of war, those were kept from public view. The worst images, mass casualties, war crimes, the true brutality of battle, were hidden, ensuring that morale remained strong. Vietnam, however, was a different story. For the first time, war was covered in real time, with minimal censorship. Unrestricted journalists had the freedom to report directly from the front lines, exposing the American public to the harshest realities of war. And some images became impossible to forget. The execution of Nguyen Van Lem, shot at point-blank range, the napalm girl, Phan Thi Kim Phuc, screaming in pain from severe burns, the horrifying scenes from the My Lai massacre, where hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians were slaughtered by American troops. These images and reports fundamentally changed how Americans viewed the war. In World War II, controlled media reinforced patriotism and a sense of unity. But in Vietnam, the relentless exposure to suffering, destruction, and civilian casualties led to mass protests. Many Americans began to question why their country was involved at all. And worst of all, this sentiment was often directed at the soldiers themselves. Unlike World War II veterans, who were celebrated as liberators, Vietnam veterans returned home to hostility. Instead of being greeted with parades, many were met with insults. Some were even spat on. The media coverage had turned public anger not just against the war, but against the very people who had fought it. This stark contrast in how the wars were reported and how that reporting shaped public perception was one of the defining reasons Vietnam was worse than World War II. In World War II, soldiers were hailed as heroes. In Vietnam, they were too often seen as villains. The unfiltered reality of the war made it impossible to ignore its horrors, but in doing so, it left countless Vietnam veterans feeling abandoned, demonized, and utterly unappreciated. Another reason Vietnam was worse than World War II was the lack of a clear mission. In World War II, the goal was simple: defeat the Axis. Vietnam, however, was a war with shifting objectives, unclear enemies, and no defined victory. Earlier, we hinted at something even more unsettling about Vietnam, something that went beyond the brutality of combat and the hostility at home. Now it's time to confront it. What happens when soldiers aren't just fighting a war, but questioning why they're there in the first place? Unclear purpose. If the horrors of combat and the hostility at home weren't enough, Vietnam had one final devastating difference from World War II. Many soldiers didn't even know what they were fighting for. Unlike World War II, where the mission was straightforward and widely supported, the Vietnam War was vague, controversial, and lacked a clear end goal. In World War II, the purpose of US involvement was clear from the start. After Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, there was no debate about whether the US should go to war. Americans rallied behind the cause, united in their determination to defeat fascism. The war was seen as a fight against tyranny, with the US and its allies battling aggressive expansionist regimes guilty of war crimes. Because the war had a clear enemy and a well-defined goal, most Americans supported the war effort without question. Unlike World War II, where the enemy and objectives were well-defined, Vietnam had no clear purpose in the eyes of many Americans. The US justified its involvement as part of the Cold War policy of containing communism, but many questioned whether Vietnam was a direct threat to the US. Unlike World War II, which was officially declared by Congress, Vietnam was never formally declared a war. Instead, US involvement escalated gradually, with increasing troop deployments under multiple presidents. The lack of a clear objective, combined with rising casualties and growing public disillusionment, led to widespread protests, making it one of the most divisive wars in US history. Another major issue was the lack of a clear path to victory. Unlike World War II, where US forces fought uniformed German and Japanese soldiers, the Viet Cong used guerrilla warfare, blending in with civilians, making it difficult to distinguish the enemy. Success was often measured in body counts rather than territorial gains, creating a grim and demoralizing strategy. While World War II lasted about 4 years for the US, Vietnam dragged on for nearly a decade with no clear progress, frustrating both soldiers and civilians. The lack of purpose in Vietnam took a toll on morale and made the war psychologically harder for troops. World War II soldiers knew they were fighting for their country's survival. Vietnam soldiers often felt like they were fighting for nothing, sent into the jungle with no clear reason. Desertion rates were higher, and some soldiers even disobeyed orders or refused to fight. The combination of an unclear mission, public opposition, and the harsh combat conditions left many Vietnam veterans with deep psychological scars, struggling with PTSD and feelings of abandonment upon returning home. World War II had an undeniable reason for US involvement, with clear enemies and a clear victory strategy. Vietnam, on the other hand, was a confusing, unwinnable war that lacked public support, a defined mission, and a clear exit strategy. This left many soldiers feeling lost, unmotivated, and later unappreciated when they returned home. In the end, Vietnam wasn't just deadlier, it felt meaningless. World War II had a clear enemy and purpose. Vietnam had neither. Soldiers fought a hidden enemy for an unclear cause, only to come home to rejection. The war may have ended, but for many who served, the battle never truly stopped. And that's about it. What do you think? Let us know in the comments below. And if you like this video, don't forget to drop a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks for watching.